Today we're here with our friend from BDRC, Jann Ronis, the executive director, to really celebrate an amazing, legendary figure, Jann Smith. We now are commemorating him with this beautiful book, and he came in from San Diego today just to be with us and share a little bit of the background of how this book came about, and to begin the process of giving ourselves a moment to remember Jann Smith, who was a dear friend of the Asian Legacy Library as well. So welcome, Jann.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. I'm really grateful for the invitation, and I've been having just a wonderful time, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak a little bit, just briefly, about Jann, about our organization, and what we've been up to, and our partnership together, which has been going on now for many years. But maybe I should start with Jann Smith, Jann Smith, Ellis Jann Smith. He was born in 1936 and passed away in 2010. So it's been over 12 years now since then. Jann, there's so much we can say about him, and if you want the fuller picture, read the book. But really, he should be judged by his impact and what he left behind. So Jann did a lot over many decades, but I think we can talk about Jann 1.0 and Jann 2.0. Jann 1.0 started in the 60s. In 1963-64, Jann was a PhD student at University of Leiden and went to India on a grant to meet some teachers, gather some books, basically do research for his PhD. And because he was such a brilliant scholar, he had a really bright career in academia, and he could have easily just had some excellent interviews, collected some books, gone home, written an amazing dissertation, better than what anyone else had done to date, ended up at an Ivy League school and just lived a comfortable life. But he didn't follow that path. In 1964, there in New Delhi, he understood that the precious scriptures were not well protected, because there were just other very important concerns that their custodians needed to deal with. And so he thought that maybe he could intervene in some way to help gather together, catalog, and even reproduce, duplicate, and then distribute widely these precious texts. And so after getting situated in the area, he met various teachers, inquired into which sorts of institutions could help him, and he ended up at the Library of Congress because of their funding scheme. There was a way that he could convince them to sponsor the reproduction of books. So he did that. So over the course of 20 years in New Delhi, he, along with his many partners, reproduced over 8,000 volumes, and each of these volumes has hundreds of pages. And so there's a magical story here, but in brief, Jann was able to convince the printers and the Library of Congress to support the printing of 100 copies of each of these 8,000 volumes. 25 of the volumes were purchased by the Library of Congress and sent to major research libraries around the country. The price that the library paid for those 25 volumes covered the complete print run, which meant that the remaining 75 copies were available for just a few rupees. So in a sense, not only did he just reproduce or duplicate or make a few spare copies of these texts, which were so irreplaceable, but he actually produced so many copies that they circulated more widely, I think, than they ever did before. So really exceptional work. And this was between the 60s and the mid-80s. Then his career took him to other places outside of India, and then upon retirement in the late 90s, he returned to the States, first to New York and then to Boston, and he thought, now with digital technology, digital cameras, the internet, computer databases, and so forth, it's time for a 2.0 preservation effort. This time, let's make it digital. So he returned to the States with a voluminous library of over 10,000 copies, 10,000 volumes of books, and found friends and supporters to help him figure out a way to digitize all of these books and disseminate them widely in the States, in Europe, in Japan, and elsewhere. And so those scholars were also very intent on getting access to these new scans. And so in just a matter of a few years, researchers had available to them very convenient and portable libraries that matched any physical library, in fact, exceeded them in scope, but were so easy to share and pass around and use whenever and wherever. So that's what Jann did. Jann 1.0 and 2.0.
Amazing. Jann, I have a question. Going back to the 60s and 70s, the Library of Congress, who spent this money, right,
Yes.
in India, two things. It was called, what was it called back then?
Sure. So Jann, being a bodhisattva, as they say, he had great skill and means. And so he investigated the different funding schemes of the Library of Congress and figured out that they were
owed
receiving money.
Right?
They owed money, yes.
To the American government, and they defaulted on a loan, right?
The government of India had been receiving the money and aid from the Food for Peace program.
Right.
And they were supposed to pay it back in cash, and that was just not feasible. And so the Library of Congress and other entities said, well, pay us back in kind. And so there were a couple of hurdles to getting the Library of Congress to support the reproduction and purchase and distribution. You have to produce something that we'll recognize as a book. Who's going to do that? Who has the ability to go through all these books, transcribe the titles, translate them, come up with tables of contents and introductions? I mean, that would be a superhuman feat. And Jann said, watch me. I'm a great scholar. And so of those 8,000 volumes that he reproduced, he wrote the introductions, very scholarly and accurate, for at least 5,000 of them.
That's amazing.
So that's how it was
And it was
done.
called the PL
The
480.
PL 480 program, Public Law 480. So in a sense, I just talked about Jann 1.0 and Jann 2.0. We could say PL 480 1.0, PL 480 2.0. Yes, the public law.
Maybe I'll ask you about this beautiful book. I would
sure.
absolutely recommend it to anyone, but I wonder if you could tell us about how this book came to be.
Sure. So the book is called Digital Dharma, Recovering Wisdom. It was published in October of 2022 through Wisdom Publications. And as JB mentioned before, the main creator of the book is a filmmaker who followed Jann around in 2008 and 2009 when he returned to India and Nepal bearing many, many gifts. So TBRC, Jann's organization, was founded in 1999, and as I mentioned before, he intended to digitize all of his texts. Well, it took a while. It took several years before he had a critical mass of works. But by 2008, he really could say that on a single large hard drive, one could find essentially the entire literary tradition.
I remember he said that in the film.
Yes.
When he handed it over to a high, practitioner,
Yes.
he said, "It's all there, complete," and he just handed it to him, and it was,
Yes.
there we are, 2.0.
And it was, yes.
Yeah.
So this book, it's a photographic book, and the content was created on these tours of India and Nepal when Jann went to meet with his old friends who he'd partnered with decades before, and gave them all hard drives and encouraged them to open up the hard drives to see what was in there, take what was relevant to their traditions, print them, input them, but essentially turn them back into books that would be read and contemplated and practiced.
Amazing.
So that's the book.
Yeah.
So we have medical texts, astrological texts, histories, biographies, poetry, and then all the major periods and writers and traditions. And so digitizing that alone would have, been enough. Exactly, enough. And it took a long time. It wasn't finished, and sadly, until after Gene passed away. Gene passed away in 2010, suddenly in December, the night he returned from one of these long trips to Asia to distribute the digital copies of the books. And then the work digitizing his library ended a few years after that. And so at that point, the organization was at a crossroads. What more should they do? Because at that time, the organization didn't have access to very many other major libraries in Asia, not like we do now at the National Library of Mongolia. And so some of the major leaders of the organization thought, well, at this point, BDRC can either sort of reduce its scope and go into a kind of a maintenance mode and simply offer the initial archive available for free online perpetually, or it can scale up.
Jann, it's been wonderful to have you. And I'm thinking about the 95,000 users of your database who are probably translating these great wisdom traditions. And how that enters our world is going to be an amazing 100-year, I think, experience as this goes into mainstream. And we want to thank you for coming. And we want you back for the 25th if you consider coming back.
It would be my honor, yes. I want to come back and report back on what we've done and show you some of the baby steps we've made towards PL 480 3.0.
Wonderful.
And we can't do it alone. So, let's work together towards a really prosperous 25th anniversary for BDRC and for the project we're working on together.
Emma and I are just so fortunate to work with you and your team. It's been an amazing adventure doing what we're doing together in Mongolia especially. Yeah. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you. I mean, as I mentioned, when we were faced with that dilemma of whether we sort of wind down or scale up, I alluded to the fact that at that point, BDRC, given its network, didn't really have access to anything like the National Library of Mongolia. It was your path-breaking work, your tireless work, knocking on doors and establishing trust over a long time that got you into the National Library of Mongolia. So we're really benefiting from that.
We're having a good time together. And Emma and I are kind of really connected to making this go forward, and finishing that collection is essential for the world to see.
Essential for the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I said we have 35,000 volumes in our archive.
Right.
National Library of Mongolia has 40,000 volumes.
41,
so if we scan it all, it's going to double the BDRC archive just from one project.
Who knows
Let's
what's
do
in
it.
those bins? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
It's been wonderful
Yes.
to talk with you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good job. Yeah.